On a morning in the year 1668, somewhere along the Caribbean coast of the Darien, a man was being eaten alive. He had been stripped of his clothing, his weapons had been taken. His companions, those who had not already been killed, had fled into the jungle or been dragged away to separate fates. Now he knelt in the sand, or perhaps he no longer had the strength to kneel, and the men who surrounded him were not hurrying. They had time. They had been waiting for someone like him for a very long while, though they could not have known it. And he, this man who had once commanded fleets, who had sacked cities, who had devised tortures so baroque that Spanish colonial officials wrote home about them in language usually reserved for descriptions of hell, he was discovering what it felt like to be on the other side of the blade. The Cuna did not keep written records. We do not know exactly how long it took. We do not know whether he screamed or begged or maintained the cold silence that had so terrified his enemies when he was the one holding the knife. What we know is that they cut him apart piece by piece, and that they roasted those pieces over open flames, and that they consumed him, not in frenzy, not in mindless savagery, but with the deliberate intention of destroying not just his body, but whatever dark spirit they believed animated it. They wanted to make sure he could not come back. His name was Jean-David Nau. The Spanish called him El Olonés. The English called him l'Olonais. History remembers him, when it remembers him at all, as François l'Olonais, a name that simply meant the man from Olon, a fishing village on the Atlantic coast of France, so small that most maps did not bother to mark it. He had been born there sometime around 1630, give or take a few years in either direction, because no one was keeping careful track of the children of fishermen in the aftermath of the 30 Years' War. He had died in Darien sometime around 1668, give or take a few months, because no one was keeping careful track of what happened to buccaneers who wandered too far from their ships. Between those two uncertain dates, he became arguably the most feared man in the Caribbean. He captured more Spanish treasure than most colonial governors saw in a lifetime. He tortured prisoners with a creativity that still disturbs historians who study the period. He bit open a man's chest and chewed on his heart while the man was still alive, a detail so grotesque that scholars have sometimes assumed it must be exaggeration, propaganda, the kind of atrocity story that enemies invent about each other. But the account comes from Alexandre Exquemelin, who sailed with the Buccaneers, who knew l'Olonais personally, who had no particular reason to lie. And when you read the full scope of what l'Olonais did during his brief and bloody career, the heart-eating does not seem out of character. It seems, if anything, like a logical escalation. This is the story of how a French peasant became a monster, how a monster became a legend, and how that legend ended in the most fitting way imaginable, consumed by the same jungle that had witnessed so many of his crimes. It is also a story about what the Caribbean was in the 17th century, a laboratory for human cruelty operating beyond the reach of any law, where the collision of empires produced men whose capacity for violence exceeded anything the old world had prepared them for. L'Olonais did not invent the brutality of the buccaneer world, but he perfected it. He made an art of terror, and in the end, the art consumed the artist. To understand what created François l'Olonais, we must first understand what destroyed him, or rather, what made him in the first place. We must understand the world that took a boy from a fishing village and turned him into something that could pull out a man's tongue with his bare hands and feel nothing but professional satisfaction. The sources for his life are limited, as they are for most buccaneers of this period. Our primary account comes from De Amerikaanse Zeeroevers, published in Dutch in 1678 by Alexandre Olivier Exquemelin, a man whose own biography remains frustratingly unclear. Exquemelin may have been French, he may have been Dutch, he may have been Flemish. What we know is that he arrived in the Caribbean as an indentured servant, possibly to the French West India Company, possibly to the buccaneers directly, and that he spent years among the sea rovers of Tortuga and Hispaniola before returning to Europe to write what would become the most widely read account of Caribbean piracy ever published. His book was translated into Spanish, English, German, and French, each translation adding its own embellishments and errors, so that by the time the text reached most readers, It had been filtered through multiple layers of editorial intervention. Exquemelin knew L'Ollonais. He may have sailed with him. His account of L'Ollonais' career has the texture of eyewitness testimony, specific details, named ships, described coastlines, mixed with the inevitable distortions of memory and the literary conventions of the age. Modern historians treat him with cautious respect, credible on the broad outlines, unreliable on precise numbers, occasionally prone to dramatic embellishment, but not to outright fabrication. When Exquemelin describes L'Ollonais biting into a man's chest, he is probably telling the truth as he understood it. Whether he saw it himself or heard it from someone who did, or assembled it from multiple accounts that had grown in the telling, these distinctions are lost. We also have Spanish colonial records, dispatches from governors, reports from naval commanders, testimonies from survivors of L'Ollonais' raids. These documents confirm the broad arc of Exquemelin's narrative while adding details he omitted or did not know. They confirm that L'Ollonais was real, that his attacks happened, that the Spanish genuinely feared him in a way they did not fear most buccaneers. The governor of Havana issued specific orders concerning L'Ollonais' capture. Spanish ships received instructions to kill him on sight rather than take him prisoner. This was not standard procedure. It tells us something about how the Spanish understood the threat he posed, not just to their ships and their cities, but to the psychological order of their colonial project. What we cannot know with any certainty is what L'Ollonais thought. We have no letters from him, no journals, no recorded conversations. We have only his actions which speak loudly but not clearly. Was he a sadist who enjoyed inflicting pain for its own sake? Was he a calculating terrorist who understood that extreme violence produced strategic advantages? Was he a man so damaged by his own early experiences that cruelty had become the only language he knew how to speak? The sources do not tell us. They describe what he did. They do not explain why. This uncertainty is itself part of the story. L'Ollonais emerged from a world designed to produce men like him, a world that took human beings and ground them into instruments of profit and violence. And when one of those instruments proved particularly effective, no one thought to ask about his inner life. He was useful. He was successful. He was terrifying. What more did anyone need to know? The France that Jean David now was born into had just finished tearing itself apart. The 30 Years' War, which ended in 1648 when he was roughly 18 years old, had killed perhaps 8 million people across Europe, a number so large it becomes abstract, a statistic rather than a reality. The fighting had been particularly brutal in the German states, but France had not been spared. Armies marched through French territory, villages were burned, crops were destroyed. Populations fled, starved, died of diseases that followed in the wake of military campaigns. The Treaty of Westphalia, which ended the war, established the foundations of the modern European state system, but it did not restore the dead, rebuild the farms, or heal the trauma that a generation of children had absorbed simply by growing up in a world where violence was the normal condition of existence. The Atlantic coast of France, where the village of Les Sables d'Olonne sat exposed to the winds coming off the Bay of Biscay, was not the worst affected region, but it was poor. It had always been poor. The economy was fishing and salt, the two industries that the coast could support, and both were precarious. The fishing grounds were productive but dangerous. The salt marshes required constant labor to maintain. A boy growing up in Les Sables d'Olonne in the 1630s and 1640s would have learned early that survival was not guaranteed, that the sea could kill you, that the winter could kill you, that hunger was not a metaphor but a regular visitor. We do not know what happened to L'Ollonais' family. We do not know if he had parents who loved him or siblings who played with him, or a household that gave him some template for what normal human relationships looked like. What we know is that sometime in his adolescence or early adulthood, he left France for the Caribbean. The mechanism of his departure is also unclear. Exquemelin says he came as an engagé, an indentured servant bound to labor for a master in the colonies for a period of 3 years in exchange for passage across the Atlantic. This was a common pathway. French colonial enterprises were perpetually short of labor, and young men from impoverished backgrounds were perpetually in need of opportunity. The contract seemed like a fair exchange. 3 years of your life in return for a chance at something better. The reality was more brutal than the contract suggested. An engagé in the French Caribbean was, for practical purposes, a slave. He could be bought and sold. He could be beaten. He worked from before dawn to after dark, clearing land, planting crops, building structures, doing whatever his master required. The Caribbean climate was hostile to European bodies in ways that no one fully understood. Tropical diseases killed newcomers at horrifying rates, and the survivors often emerged weakened, scarred, fundamentally changed by fevers and infections their immune systems had never encountered. The food was poor, the housing was worse. The masters were men who had themselves often been brutalized by the system and who reproduced that brutalization on the bodies of their servants. Jean-David now served his 3 years, somewhere on Hispaniola, the island that now contains Haiti and the Dominican Republic. He worked for a master whose name is not recorded, doing labor whose nature is not specified, under conditions we can only infer from what we know about the system as a whole. He emerged from that experience in his early 20s, technically free but owning nothing, skilled in nothing that the colonial economy valued, surrounded by other young men in similar positions. The legitimate paths forward were few. A man without capital could not become a planter. A man without connections could not rise in the colonial administration. A man without skills could only sell his labor. And the labor market in the Caribbean was flooded with other men who had nothing else to sell. But there was another economy operating in Hispaniola, parallel to the legitimate one, and it was hungry for exactly the kind of men that the legitimate economy had discarded. The Buccaneers of Hispaniola had not started as pirates, they had started as butchers. The name itself came from the buccaneer, a wooden frame used for smoking meat over an open fire. The technique was indigenous. The Taino and Arawak peoples had used it for centuries before Europeans arrived. But the men who adopted it in the early 17th century were European refugees, castaways, runaways, and misfits who had found their way to the northern and western coasts of Hispaniola, where the Spanish colonial administration's control was thin and where vast herds of feral cattle and pigs roamed free. These animals were the descendants of livestock brought by the Spanish in the early decades of colonization, released or escaped, multiplied across generations in a landscape that had no natural predators capable of controlling them. By the time Jean-David now arrived in the Caribbean, the herds numbered in the hundreds of thousands. A man with a musket, a knife, and a boucan could hunt these animals, smoke their meat, cure their hides, and sell the products to passing ships. It was hard living. The buccaneers slept rough, dressed in animal skins, stiff with blood and grease, and looked so wild that visitors sometimes mistook them for a new species of human. But it was living. It was free. No master, no contract, no one telling you what to do. The buccaneer communities that developed on the north coast of Hispaniola and on the nearby island of Tortuga were not lawless in the sense of having no rules. They had rules. They were simply their own rules, developed to serve the specific needs of men who had rejected or been rejected by the official colonial order. The rules governed hunting rights, the division of spoils, the resolution of disputes. They were enforced not by courts, but by social pressure and, when necessary, by violence. A man who cheated his partners would find himself without partners. A man who could not be trusted would find himself alone, and a man alone in the buccaneer world did not survive long. The transition from hunting to raiding was gradual and, from a certain perspective, logical. The buccaneers had boats, small vessels, pirogues, and canoes used to transport their goods and to move between hunting grounds. They had weapons, muskets, and long knives, necessary tools for hunting wild cattle. They had experience living rough, moving fast, operating in terrain that confused and exhausted enemies. And all around them, sailing through the Caribbean waters that lapped at their shores, were Spanish ships carrying treasure. The Spanish, in the 17th century, controlled the richest colonies in the Americas. The silver mines of Mexico and Peru produced wealth on a scale that modern observers find difficult to conceptualize. enough silver to destabilize the economies of entire continents, enough gold to make and unmake kingdoms. This wealth flowed through the Caribbean on its way to Spain, concentrated in annual treasure fleets that followed predictable routes and schedules. Even the smaller ships, the ones that carried trade goods between colonial ports, were rich by the standards of men who owned nothing. Why hunt cattle when you could hunt ships? The Buccaneers began raiding Spanish vessels in the 1640s and 1650s, small-scale operations at first, attacking isolated merchant ships and coastal settlements. The Spanish responded with counterattacks, burning buccaneer camps, hunting the hunters. This only accelerated the transformation. Men who might have been content to smoke meat and cure hides found their livelihoods destroyed. Men who had nowhere else to go found themselves pushed toward the only profession that remained open to them. By the time Jean-David Now joined their ranks, probably in the mid-1650s, a few years after completing his indenture, the Buccaneers of Tortuga had evolved into something genuinely dangerous. This was the world Jean-David Now entered when he decided to become a pirate. Or perhaps it is more accurate to say that this was the world that had been preparing to receive him since before he was born. A world that needed violent men, that rewarded violent men, that took the violence that other societies tried to suppress and channeled it outward against designated enemies. Jean-David Now, the peasant boy from Olon, was about to become François l'Olonnais, the terror of the Spanish Main. The transformation would not be difficult. The raw material was already there. The Buccaneer world simply gave it direction. His early career is obscured by the same silence that covers his childhood. Exquemelin tells us that l'Olonnais served for a time on Buccaneer vessels, learning the trade before receiving his own command. This was the standard path. A new arrival proved himself useful, demonstrated his courage and his competence, earned the respect of his peers, and eventually was elected or appointed to lead his own crew. The Buccaneers did not follow the rigid hierarchies of naval vessels. Their captains were chosen by consensus, held power only as long as the crew found them useful, and could be deposed if they failed to deliver results. It was a meritocracy of violence, and l'Olonnais proved himself meritorious. What distinguished him from other buccaneers was not his skill as a sailor. The sources suggest he was competent but not exceptional, or his strategic brilliance, or even his personal courage, though he seems to have possessed all of these qualities in adequate measure. What distinguished him was his willingness to go further than anyone else. His capacity for cruelty was not incidental to his success. It was the foundation of it. The logic of terror, as l'Olonnais seems to have understood it, was simple. The Caribbean was vast. The Spanish had more ships, more soldiers, more resources than the Buccaneers could ever match. A direct confrontation would always favor the Spanish. But the Spanish had a weakness. They wanted to survive. Their soldiers wanted to see their families again. Their officers wanted to return to Spain with their fortunes made. Their colonists wanted to live out their days in peace. This desire to survive could be exploited. If you made the cost of resistance high enough, not just death, but torture, mutilation, spectacle, then resistance would begin to seem irrational. Men who might fight to the death against an ordinary enemy would surrender to an enemy they believed capable of anything. L'Olonnais made himself that enemy. He cultivated a reputation for extremity. When he captured Spanish prisoners, he did not simply execute them. He made their deaths instructive. He had men stretched on racks. He had men burned alive. He had men cut apart piece by piece while their companions watched, understanding that they might be next, that the only way to avoid this fate was to tell l'Olonnais whatever he wanted to know. The most famous incident, the one that cemented his reputation throughout the Caribbean, occurred sometime in the early 1660s, though the exact date is uncertain. L'Olonnais had captured a group of Spanish soldiers and was interrogating them about the defenses of a nearby town. They were not cooperating. Perhaps they were genuinely ignorant. Perhaps they were loyal enough to prefer death over betrayal. L'Olonnais did not care about their reasons. He only cared about results. Exquemelin describes what happened next with a clinical precision that somehow makes it worse. Lolone selected one of the prisoners, a man whose name is not recorded, whose face is not described, whose existence is preserved only by the manner of his death. He cut open the man's chest. He reached inside. He pulled out the man's heart. And then, this is the detail that is echoed through 3.5 centuries. He bit into it, chewing the still warm muscle while the other prisoners watched. "If you do not tell me what I want to know," he said to the survivors, or words to that effect, "I will do the same to every one of you." They told him what he wanted to know. Did it happen exactly this way? The honest answer is that we cannot be certain. Exquemelin was not present for every event he described, and atrocity stories have a tendency to grow in the telling. The Spanish, for their own propaganda purposes, had every reason to exaggerate the brutality of the Buccaneers. The Buccaneers themselves had every reason to cultivate reputations for savagery that exceeded their actual deeds. But the convergence of sources suggests that something like this did occur, probably more than once. Spanish colonial records from this period contain references to Lolone that match the tone, if not always the precise details, of Exquemelin's account. The governor of Havana, writing to Madrid, described Lolone as a monster who must be destroyed at any cost. Spanish naval commanders reported that crews were reluctant to engage him, not because of his military prowess, but because of what he might do to them if they lost. Survivors of his raids testified to acts of cruelty that their interrogators found difficult to believe, even though they had no reason to exaggerate. Exaggeration would only have made them look weak. The cumulative weight of evidence suggests that Lolone was, in fact, exactly what his reputation claimed, a man who had discovered that systematic cruelty was not merely satisfying but useful, not merely an expression of rage, but a tool for achieving specific outcomes. He was not the first torturer in Caribbean history. He was not the last. But he was perhaps the most deliberate, the most conscious of what he was doing and why it worked. He understood that terror was a technology, and he became a master of its application. This understanding set him apart from most of his peers. Other buccaneers were violent because the profession required violence. Lolone was violent because he had grasped something fundamental about the relationship between pain and power. Pain could be inflicted on individual bodies, but its effects radiated outward. Every Spanish prisoner who watched a companion die screaming became a messenger, carrying the story of what he had seen to other potential victims. Every town that heard what Lolone had done to the last town became more likely to surrender rather than fight. The individual deaths were investments in a portfolio of fear that would pay dividends for years. By 1666, Lolone was ready to collect on that investment. He had assembled a fleet, recruited a crew, selected a target. He was going to do something that no buccaneer had ever done before. He was going to sack an entire city, not a coastal village, not an isolated outpost, but a major Spanish colonial settlement, defended by soldiers, protected by fortifications, populated by thousands of people who had heard the stories and knew what was coming for them. The city was Maracaibo. The lake that bears Maracaibo's name is not truly a lake. It is a brackish lagoon, fed by the rivers that drain the Venezuelan highlands and connected to the Caribbean Sea by a narrow strait. The Spanish had found it in 1499, during one of the early voyages of exploration that followed Columbus's landfall, and they had named it for a local cacique whose people would soon be swept away by disease, enslavement, and conquest. By the mid-17th century, Maracaibo had become a significant colonial port, not wealthy enough to warrant constant protection by Spanish naval forces, but prosperous enough to attract attention. The surrounding region produced cacao, tobacco, hides, the raw materials that Spanish merchants transformed into European luxury goods. The population included Spanish colonists, African slaves, indigenous laborers, and the mixed-race communities that emerged wherever these groups overlapped. The city had churches, government buildings, warehouses, private homes. It had approximately 3,000 permanent residents and could defend itself with perhaps 800 soldiers when fully mobilized. Gibraltar, a smaller settlement on the opposite shore of the lake, served as Maracaibo's economic satellite, an outpost for processing goods from the interior, a secondary port, a place where overflow population could settle. Together, the two cities controlled access to one of the most productive agricultural regions in the Spanish Caribbean. Lolonais intended to take them both. The fleet he assembled for this expedition was the largest the Buccaneers had ever put together, 8 ships carrying approximately 660 men. These were not naval vessels, but converted merchantmen, trading ships, captured Spanish prizes, anything that could float and mount cannons. The men who crewed them were drawn from across the Buccaneer world: French, English, Dutch, Portuguese, African, indigenous, and every possible mixture of these categories. What they had in common was not nationality or language, but profession. They were raiders, they were killers, and they were betting their lives on Lolonais' judgment that the prize was worth the risk. The expedition departed Tortuga in the spring of 1667, sailed west toward the entrance of Lake Maracaibo, and immediately encountered the first of many obstacles. The Spanish had built a fortress at the entrance to the lake, a stone fortification called San Carlos de la Barra that guarded the channel with heavy guns. Any ship attempting to pass would come under fire. The defenders knew the Buccaneers were coming, ships had been spotted, warnings had been sent, and they had prepared accordingly. What the defenders did not understand was the psychology of the man they faced. A rational commander confronting fortified positions and prepared enemies might have reconsidered, might have looked for softer targets, might have calculated odds and decided the mission was too risky. Lolonais was not a rational commander in that sense. He was a terrorist, and terrorists need spectacular victories to maintain their reputations. Backing down was not an option. It would unmake everything he had built. He landed his forces on the coast near the fortress, out of range of its guns. He marched them overland through jungle that no European army was designed to traverse. He approached the fortress from the landward side, where its defenses were weaker, where the Spanish had not expected to need them. The assault was brutal and brief. The defenders fought because the alternative was surrender to Lolonais, and they knew what that meant. But they were outnumbered, outpositioned, overwhelmed. The fortress fell. The channel was open. The fleet sailed through into the lake toward Maracaibo. The city's population had received warning. Some had fled into the interior, carrying what valuables they could transport. Some had stayed, perhaps believing the fortifications would hold, perhaps having nowhere else to go. The governor had organized a defense, but his soldiers were demoralized, undertrained, and they had heard the stories. They knew who was coming. Lolonais did not attack immediately. He anchored his fleet offshore, visible from the city walls, and waited. He let the waiting do its work. He let the people of Maracaibo imagine what was about to happen. He let them remember every story they had heard. He let their fear ripen. When the assault finally came, it was almost anticlimactic. The Spanish defense collapsed. Soldiers who might have fought to protect their homes against an ordinary enemy found themselves facing the prospect of capture by Lolonais, and the calculation changed. Many fled, some surrendered, some hid. The Buccaneers entered Maracaibo without meeting significant resistance, and once they were inside, the real work began. The work, as Lolonais understood it, was extraction. The city contained wealth, in homes, in churches, in warehouses, in the bodies and labor of the population itself, and that wealth needed to be extracted as efficiently as possible. The Buccaneers had a system. They had done this before, on smaller scales. They locked the population in the churches. They searched the buildings for hidden valuables. They interrogated anyone who might know where additional treasure was concealed. They tortured those who resisted or seemed to be lying. Lolonais presided over the process like a master craftsman supervising his workshop. He did not participate in every interrogation, did not personally extract every confession. But his reputation hung over everything, giving weight to every threat, making every victim understand that the man asking questions was not bluffing. The townspeople gave up their silver, their gold, their jewelry, their heirlooms. They revealed hidden caches, buried strongboxes, concealed rooms. They betrayed their neighbors. They did whatever was necessary to avoid becoming the next demonstration of what Lolonais could do. The occupation of Maracaibo lasted 2 weeks. During that time, The Buccaneers stripped the city systematically, loading their ships with everything valuable enough to justify the cargo space. They also took prisoners, wealthy colonists who might be ransomed, skilled craftsmen who might be useful, women whose presence in the Buccaneer camps would serve other purposes. The sources are vague on this last point, but the silence is itself suggestive. The Buccaneers were not monks. The population they had conquered included women and children. What happened to them is not something the chroniclers chose to describe in detail. When the extraction was complete, when every house had been searched, every prisoner questioned, every valuable item catalogued, Lolonais turned his attention to Gibraltar. The smaller settlement had received even more warning than Maracaibo. Its population had watched the fleet pass, had heard the sounds of battle at the fortress, had received refugees fleeing from the larger city. They knew what was coming, and they had time to prepare. Many had fled. Those who remained had fortified their positions, gathered their weapons, resolved to fight. They fought. For the first time in the expedition, Lolonais faced genuine resistance, not the token defense of demoralized soldiers, but the determined opposition of men who understood that surrender meant death and had chosen to die fighting instead. The battle for Gibraltar was bloody. The Buccaneers took casualties. For several hours, the outcome was uncertain. But the mathematics of violence still favored Lolonais. He had more men. He had more guns. He had the momentum of his previous victories and the desperation of men who had come too far to turn back. Gibraltar fell as Maracaibo had fallen, and the aftermath was the same. Systematic extraction, interrogation, torture, the methodical conversion of human suffering into transportable wealth. The total haul from the Maracaibo raid was extraordinary. Excamelin estimates it at 260,000 pieces of 8 in cash, plus jewels, plate, and other valuables, a sum worth millions in modern currency, distributed among 660 men who, a few months earlier, had owned nothing but their weapons and their willingness to use them. Lolonais himself, as commander, took a larger share. He was now, by the standards of the Buccaneer world, a wealthy man. He had done something no one else had done. He had proven that even defended cities could fall to Buccaneers, that the Spanish colonial empire was vulnerable in ways that previous raiders had only suspected. The fleet sailed out of Lake Maracaibo, past the fortress they had captured, back into the Caribbean Sea. The ships turned toward Tortuga, where the loot would be divided, and the men would spend their shares in the taverns and brothels that served no other purpose than to extract money from returning Buccaneers. The expedition had been a triumph. Lolonais was at the peak of his power, his reputation cemented, his future seemingly assured. He had perhaps a year left to live. The return to Tortuga was everything a Buccaneer could want it to be. The ships came into harbor heavy with plunder, their holds stuffed with silver and silk and the accumulated wealth of 2 Spanish cities. Word traveled faster than the vessels themselves, runners in small boats, fishermen who had spotted the fleet, merchants who kept their ears pressed to the pulse of Caribbean commerce. By the time Lolonais dropped anchor, Tortuga already knew what he had accomplished. The island celebrated as only Tortuga could celebrate. The taverns filled, the brothels overflowed. Men who had owned nothing 6 months earlier now threw coins across gambling tables, bought rounds for strangers, commissioned new clothes and new weapons and new boots that would fall apart in the jungle within a month. The economy of Tortuga was designed for exactly this moment: the sudden influx of wealth, the frantic spending, the rapid redistribution of plunder from the men who had risked their lives to the merchants and madams and card-sharp who had stayed safely ashore. Within weeks, most of the Buccaneers would be broke again. This was the rhythm of the life. This was how it worked. Lolonais himself did not squander his share. The sources suggest he was more calculating than his men, more aware that wealth was a tool rather than an end. He invested in ships, in supplies, in the infrastructure of future expeditions. He maintained his reputation through strategic generosity, buying drinks for captains he wanted to impress, financing the debts of men who might prove useful, making himself the center of a web of obligation and loyalty. He was building something. Whether he understood this consciously or simply acted on instinct, he was constructing the apparatus for even larger operations. But something else was happening too, something harder to trace in the documentary record, but essential to understanding what came next. Lolone was changing. Or perhaps the success was revealing what had always been there, stripping away whatever restraints poverty and obscurity had imposed. The man who returned from Maracaibo was not quite the same man who had set out. He was harder, more certain, more willing to trust his own judgment against all contrary evidence. Success in the Caribbean was dangerous precisely because it encouraged exactly this kind of confidence. The sea was unpredictable. The Spanish were rebuilding their defenses. The political situation was shifting in ways that would eventually doom the entire Buccaneer enterprise. But Lolone had won so consistently, had overcome so many obstacles, had watched so many enemies fall before him that he began to believe his own legend. He began to think that what had worked before would always work again. He began to plan an expedition that would dwarf everything he had previously attempted. The target was Nicaragua. Not a single city this time, but an entire province. Not a lightning raid, but a sustained campaign of conquest. The plan called for sailing to the coast of Honduras, ascending the San Juan River into the interior, and capturing the wealthy towns that Spanish colonial administration had built far from the sea, believing them safe from exactly the kind of predator that Lolone had become. It was audacious. It was unprecedented. It was, in retrospect, insane. But Lolone was not thinking in terms of what was reasonable. He was thinking in terms of what was possible for a man who had already done the impossible. He had taken Maracaibo. He had tortured truth from prisoners who should have died rather than speak. He had built a fleet from nothing and led it to victory against fortified positions. Why should Nicaragua be any different? Why should the interior of Central America resist him when the Caribbean coast had not? The expedition began to take shape in the early months of 1668. Lolone assembled the largest force he had ever commanded, somewhere between 700 and 1,000 men, depending on which source you trust, carried in 6 or 7 ships. The flagship was a captured Spanish vessel of considerable size, crewed by veterans of the Maracaibo campaign who believed their commander was invincible. The other captains included Moses van Klein, a Dutch buccaneer of considerable reputation, and several French commanders whose names the sources preserve with varying degrees of clarity. This was not a raiding party. This was an army. They sailed in the spring, coasting along the northern shore of Honduras, looking for the river mouth that would carry them into the interior. The plan required finding the San Juan and navigating upstream through jungle that no European had mapped, against currents that would slow their progress toward cities that had never been attacked by sea because no one had ever been mad enough to try. The first sign of trouble came almost immediately. The winds were wrong. The currents were wrong. The coast was not where the charts said it should be, because the charts were wrong too, compiled from fragmentary reports and hopeful guesses, adequate for the well-traveled routes, but useless for this kind of exploratory venture. The fleet found itself becalmed for days at a time, drifting in waters where Spanish patrol vessels might appear at any moment. Food began to run short. Fresh water became a concern. The men who had signed on expecting quick action and quicker plunder grew restless. Lolone responded the only way he knew how, with violence and forward motion. He drove the fleet onward, refusing to acknowledge that the expedition was already in trouble. When they finally made landfall, it was not at the mouth of the San Juan, but somewhere else entirely, a stretch of coast that offered neither the river they sought nor any obvious path to wealth. They had missed their target by dozens of miles, perhaps hundreds. The maps were useless, the local geography was hostile, and they were running out of food. What followed was a series of increasingly desperate improvisations. Lolone led his men ashore and marched them through jungle that seemed designed to kill Europeans. The vegetation was impenetrable. The insects carried diseases that the Buccaneers had no immunity against. The local indigenous populations, who had learned through generations of experience that strange men with weapons meant death and slavery, melted away before them, leaving nothing to plunder and no one to interrogate. The Spanish settlements that were supposed to be within easy reach did not materialize. The intelligence had been wrong, or the guides had been wrong, or the entire premise of the expedition had been wrong from the beginning. The men began to die. Not in battle. There was no one to fight, but from fever and starvation and the accumulated misery of marching through endless green hell with no clear destination. They ate what they could find. Monkeys, snakes, insects, leather from their own equipment, boiled until it became something that could technically be swallowed. The fleet had become a death march, and the man leading it refused to turn back. This is where L'Ollonais' psychology becomes most visible and most disturbing. A rational commander would have recognized that the expedition had failed. A competent leader would have cut his losses, returned to the coast, and sailed back to Tortuga with whatever men and ships remained. But L'Ollonais was not operating on rational calculations anymore. He was operating on something else, pride perhaps, or the inability to accept that his luck had finally run out. He kept pushing forward, kept insisting that the next day would bring the breakthrough they needed, kept demanding that his men follow him deeper into country that was slowly killing them. The accounts from this period are fragmentary and contradictory, pieced together from survivors who eventually made it back to tell their stories. But certain episodes stand out with horrible clarity. At one point, the Buccaneers captured a small party of Spanish soldiers or scouts. The sources are unclear on the details. L'Ollonais interrogated them about the route to the nearest settlement. They claimed not to know, or gave answers he didn't believe, or simply had the misfortune to be captured by a man whose frustration had curdled into something beyond ordinary cruelty. What happened next became one of the defining stories of L'Ollonais' legend. He did not merely torture these prisoners. He did not simply kill them. According to Escamelin, who may have been present, who may have heard the story from survivors, who may have been embellishing for dramatic effect, but whose account remains the closest thing we have to a primary source, L'Ollonais cut open the chest of one prisoner with his cutlass, reached into the cavity, pulled out the man's heart, and began to gnaw on it. The image is so extreme that it seems almost unbelievable. It has the quality of propaganda, of atrocity stories invented to demonize an enemy. But Escamelin was not writing Spanish propaganda. He was a buccaneer himself, or had been, and his account of L'Ollonais is not consistently hostile. He describes the man's tactical brilliance, his courage, his ability to inspire loyalty. The heart-eating story is presented not as an invention, but as a fact. One detail among many, horrible but not unique in a career that had already included tongue-pulling and systematic torture. Whether or not it happened exactly as described, the story tells us something true about where L'Ollonais had arrived. He had crossed into territory where normal categories no longer applied. He had become something that his own men feared, something that the Spanish would describe in terms borrowed from medieval demonology, something that we might now try to explain with psychological diagnoses that did not exist in the 17th century. He was a man who had discovered that there were no limits, that he could do whatever he wanted to, whoever fell into his power, and that discovery had consumed whatever remained of his humanity. The expedition staggered on. They found a few small settlements, extracted what little wealth could be found, committed the usual atrocities. But the grand vision, the conquest of Nicaragua, the capture of wealthy interior cities, had collapsed completely. By the time they reached the coast again, the force had been reduced to a fraction of its original strength. Ships had been lost, commanders had died or deserted. The men who remained were starving, sick, and mutinous. L'Ollonais attempted to salvage something from the disaster. He led his remaining forces in a raid on a village called San Pedro, hoping to find enough food and supplies to keep the expedition alive. The raid succeeded. Technically, they took the village, but there was almost nothing there worth taking. The Spanish had learned. They had evacuated their valuables, hidden their food, left nothing for the buccaneers to steal. L'Ollonais tortured the prisoners anyway, out of habit or frustration or simple malice, but even torture produced no results when there was genuinely nothing to reveal. The expedition fragmented. Ships peeled away, their captains deciding that following L'Ollonais any further was suicide. Moses Van Klein departed with his vessel and his crew, returning to Tortuga to report what had happened. Other captains did the same. Within weeks, the fleet that had set out to conquer a province had dwindled to a single ship, L'Ollonais' flagship, still carrying perhaps 400 men, still nominally under his command but increasingly ungovernable. and then the sea took even that from him. The flagship ran aground somewhere on the coast of what is now Panama, in the region the Spanish called the Darien. The details are murky, whether it was a storm, a navigational error, a reef that appeared without warning. What matters is that Lolone found himself stranded on a hostile shore with several hundred men, no ship, no provisions, and no way to escape. The Darien coast in 1668 was one of the least hospitable places on earth for a European to find himself. The jungle was dense, the climate was brutal, and the indigenous population, the Kuna people and their neighbors, had every reason to hate the strangers who washed up on their beaches. They had been raided by slavers, they had been missionized by priests, they had watched their relatives die of European diseases and been driven from their traditional lands by Spanish colonization. When they saw a group of armed Europeans struggling in the surf, they did not see fellow human beings in distress. They saw enemies. Lolone divided his men and sent them foraging in different directions, hoping to find food or a settlement or a path inland to safer territory. It was the only option available to him, but it was also the last mistake he would ever make. The Kuna were watching. They had been watching since the ship went down. They knew this terrain as intimately as the Buccaneers knew the decks of their ships, and they had decided what they were going to do. The accounts of what followed come from survivors, men who escaped by luck or who were in groups that the Kuna chose not to attack. They describe ambushes in the jungle, sudden assaults from concealed positions, arrows and clubs emerging from vegetation that had seemed empty a moment before. The Buccaneers were experienced fighters, hardened by years of combat, but they were out of their element. They were weak from hunger and disease. They were scattered across unfamiliar ground. They died. Lolone's group was among those caught. What happened to him specifically is the subject of the final story, the one that closes the account of his life with a symmetry that seems almost too perfect to be true. According to Exquemelin, always Exquemelin, our problematic but indispensable source, the Kuna did not simply kill Lolone. They captured him. And then they did to him something that echoed, deliberately or coincidentally, what he had spent his career doing to others. They cut him apart while he was still alive. They dismembered him piece by piece. And then, according to the legend that may or may not be true, but that has attached itself indelibly to his memory, they ate him. The parallel is almost too neat. The man who had gnawed on a prisoner's heart was himself consumed. The torturer became the tortured. The predator became prey. It reads like a morality tale, like the kind of just ending that history so rarely provides. And perhaps that should make us suspicious. Perhaps Exquemelin invented it, or the survivors invented it, or someone along the chain of transmission shaped the story into the form that seemed most fitting. But whether or not it happened exactly as described, the story contains a truth that transcends its factual accuracy. Lolone had lived by violence so extreme that it exceeded any practical necessity. He had made himself into a figure of terror, a name that could empty cities, a man whose reputation was itself a weapon. And in the end, he encountered people who were not impressed by his reputation, who did not know or care what he had done to the Spanish, who simply saw an enemy in their territory and responded accordingly. The Kuna had their own history, their own grievances, their own capacity for violence. They were not innocent victims, and they were not noble savages. They were human beings responding to circumstances with the tools they had available. Lolone had stumbled into their world, weakened and vulnerable, and they had destroyed him. There is no moral lesson in this. There is no cosmic justice. There is only the fact that even the most feared man in the Caribbean was still a body made of flesh, and flesh can be cut. His death was sometime in late 1668 or early 1669. The exact date is unknown because no one was keeping records for a man dying on a jungle beach. He was perhaps 40 years old, perhaps younger. He had been active as a buccaneer for less than a decade, and in that time, he had done things that would echo through centuries of Caribbean memory, shaping how Europeans thought about piracy and how indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans thought about European violence. The news of his death traveled slowly. Ships carried rumors from port to port. Survivors trickled back to Tortuga with their stories. Eventually, everyone knew Lolonais was gone. The most feared man in the Caribbean had been eaten by people whose names no European bothered to record. The age of the Buccaneers would continue for another 2 decades, producing figures like Henry Morgan, who would achieve even greater fame and considerably more comfortable endings. But none of them would quite match Lolonais for sheer concentrated horror. None of them would become, as he had become, a byword for cruelty so extreme it seemed to exceed human limits. Tortuga absorbed the news and continued functioning. The taverns stayed open, the brothels took their money, new expeditions formed and sailed and returned or didn't. The machine of Buccaneer violence ground on, indifferent to the loss of any individual component. Lolonais had been the most successful of them. For a moment, he had been the most feared, and now he was meat rotting in a jungle, or ash scattered on a beach, or nothing at all. The question that remains, the question that the sources do not answer, because the sources were not interested in asking it, is what all of this meant to the people who lived through it. Not the Buccaneers, whose perspective we know from Exquemelin and others, not the Spanish administrators, whose reports survive in colonial archives, but the others. The enslaved Africans who crewed the Buccaneer ships and whose names appear nowhere in the record. The indigenous peoples whose lands were crossed and whose villages were raided and whose relatives were tortured for information about silver that was not theirs. The women of Maracaibo and Gibraltar who experienced the occupation in ways the chroniclers chose not to describe. These people left no memoirs. They wrote no accounts. Their understanding of Lolonais and what he represented has been lost as completely as if it had never existed. We know what he did to them only from the perspective of the men who did it, men who had every reason to minimize some things and exaggerate others. Men whose moral framework was so different from ours that we cannot always tell where the boasting ends and the confession begins. What we can say is that Lolonais was not an aberration. He was an expression, an extreme expression, but an expression nonetheless, of forces that shaped the entire colonial Caribbean. The violence he embodied was the violence of a system, the violence that made sugar production and silver extraction and the entire apparatus of European colonialism possible. He simply removed the usual pretenses. He simply acted out, in individual form, what empires did at institutional scale. And yet to understand this expression, to see how one man became the embodiment of colonial violence made personal, we must return to the beginning. We must trace the arc from its origin point, from the moment when a man who would become Lolonais was still just a man with a name that history has largely forgotten. He was born Jean-David Now, sometime around 1630, give or take a few years in either direction. The sources are vague on this, as they are vague on so much concerning his early life. What we know is that he came from Les Sables d'Olonne, a fishing town on the Atlantic coast of France, in the region then called Poitou. The town gave him the name by which history would remember him, Lolonais, the man from Olonne. A simple enough etymology, a geographic identity that would travel across an ocean and become synonymous with terror. Les Sables d'Olonne, in the 1630s and 1640s, was not a place that produced gentlemen. It was a working harbor, a community of fishermen and sailors, and the families who waited for them to return from the sea. The Atlantic was both livelihood and cemetery. Men went out in small boats and sometimes did not come back. The town faced the open ocean, exposed to storms that rolled in from the west carrying salt and rain, and the constant reminder that the sea took what it wanted. We do not know who his parents were. We do not know if he had siblings who survived childhood. We do not know what kind of education, if any, he received. The historical record simply does not contain these details, and speculation would be invention. What we can say is that he grew up in a world defined by physical labor, by the proximity of death, by the rhythms of tide and weather. He would have learned early that survival was not guaranteed, that the world owed him nothing, that strength and cunning were the currencies that mattered. France in the 1640s was not a comfortable place for those at the bottom of the social order. The 30 Years' War was grinding toward its conclusion, leaving devastation across Central Europe. The Fronde, that confused series of civil conflicts between the French crown and various noble factions, would tear through France between 1648 and 1653. Taxation was crushing, disease was endemic. For a young man of no means and no prospects, the options were limited: the army, the church, the sea, or crime. Often these categories overlapped. Sometime in his youth, again the exact date is uncertain, Jean-David now made the decision that would set the trajectory of his life. He became an engagé, an indentured servant bound for the French colonies in the Caribbean. This was not an unusual choice. Thousands of young Frenchmen made it during the 17th century, trading 3 years of unfree labor for passage across the Atlantic and the hope, however slim, of eventual freedom and perhaps even prosperity in the New World. The system of engagement was, in practice, barely distinguishable from slavery. The engagés were bought and sold, their labor was compelled, their treatment was at the discretion of their masters. Many died before their terms expired, from disease, from overwork, from the casual violence that characterized plantation life. Those who survived often found themselves in debt, bound by new obligations, unable to accumulate the capital needed to establish themselves as free men. The Caribbean consumed these workers like fuel, burning through their bodies to produce the sugar and tobacco that European markets craved. Now was sold to a planter on Hispaniola. The island that Columbus had claimed for Spain in 1492 was, by the mid-17th century, a contested space. The Spanish controlled the eastern portion, centered on Santo Domingo. The western portion, what would eventually become Haiti, had become a haven for French and English interlopers, men who existed outside the boundaries of recognized colonial authority. It was here, on the margins of empire, that the Buccaneers emerged. The word itself comes from Buccaneer, the wooden frame used by the original hunters of Hispaniola to smoke meat. These men, French, English, Dutch, escaped slaves, indigenous remnants, lived in the forests and hunted the wild cattle and pigs that had multiplied across the island after being introduced by the Spanish. They sold the smoked meat and hides to passing ships. They answered to no government. They were, in the language of the time, masterless men. Now served his term of indenture. The sources tell us this much, though they do not tell us what he endured during those years. We can make educated guesses. The work was brutal. The climate was punishing. Disease was everywhere: malaria, yellow fever, dysentery, infections that spread through unsanitary conditions and inadequate nutrition. Masters beat their servants with the same instruments they used on enslaved Africans. Death was common and unremarkable. What we know is that he survived, and when his term ended, when he was technically a free man, he made the choice that would define the rest of his life. He did not attempt to become a planter himself, as some former engagé did. He did not return to France, as others tried to do. Instead, he joined the Buccaneers. The decision makes sense when you consider the alternatives. A former engagé had nothing: no capital, no connections, no land. The plantation economy required resources he did not possess. But the Buccaneers offered something different: a chance to take rather than earn, to seize rather than build, to make wealth through violence rather than labor. For a man who had already been used as a tool by others, the prospect of becoming the one who used force rather than suffered under it must have been appealing. The Buccaneer communities of western Hispaniola and the island of Tortuga operated on principles that were brutal, but in their own way, egalitarian. Plunder was divided according to agreed-upon formulas. Injuries were compensated: so many pieces of 8 for a lost eye, so many for a lost hand. Captains were elected and could be deposed if they lost the confidence of their crews. It was democracy of a sort, rough and violent, but more democratic than anything the engagés had experienced under their masters. Now proved adept at this life. He learned to sail, he learned to fight, he learned the geography of the Caribbean, the currents, the winds, the hiding places where ships could wait for prey. And he learned something else, something that would distinguish him from the common run of buccaneers. He learned that fear was a weapon more powerful than any cannon. The Spanish called him cruel. This was not in itself remarkable. The Spanish called all the buccaneers cruel, and with good reason, but now seemed to embrace cruelty not as a necessity, but as a strategy. He cultivated a reputation for excess. He made sure that stories of his violence traveled ahead of him, preparing the ground for conquests to come. When he arrived at a Spanish settlement, the inhabitants would already know his name. They would already know what he had done to others. They would already be afraid. This was calculated. This was intentional. Now understood with a clarity that suggests either genius or pathology, or both, that terror was efficient. A population that believed surrender meant survival would surrender quickly. A population that believed resistance was futile would not resist. The violence he inflicted on some became a tool for extracting compliance from others. It was economics in its way, an investment of horror that paid dividends in submission. By the early 1660s, he had risen to command his own ship. The French governor of Tortuga, a man named de la Place, gave him a letter of marque, a legal document authorizing him to attack Spanish shipping. This was the fiction that distinguished privateers from pirates, the bureaucratic veil that allowed European powers to wage war against each other through expendable intermediaries. The Buccaneers were deniable assets. They could attack Spain without France having to take official responsibility. If they were captured, they were on their own. Now, Lolonais, the name solidifying as his reputation grew, took his first commands into the shipping lanes. He captured small vessels at first, coasters and traders, the vulnerable prey that populated Caribbean waters. He killed more than he needed to. He tortured prisoners for information about other ships, other cargoes, other opportunities. He built his legend with blood. Then came his first death. The sources describe it in detail that may or may not be accurate. Lolonais was caught in a storm, or was it a battle, and his ship was wrecked on the coast of Campeche, the Yucatan Peninsula. Spanish soldiers arrived. They killed most of his crew. Lolonais survived by covering himself in blood and sand and hiding among the corpses, playing dead while the Spanish moved among the bodies, finishing off survivors. Whether this actually happened as described, we cannot know. It has the feel of legend, of a story told and retold until it hardened into myth. But what we can say is that Lolonais did survive some early disaster, some defeat that should have ended him. And he came back. He made his way inland. He found help among enslaved Africans who had their own reasons for opposing the Spanish. He stole a canoe. He gathered survivors. He returned to Tortuga and immediately began planning his next expedition. The Spanish, who had reported him dead, would discover their mistake soon enough. This resurrection, if we can call it that, only added to his legend. He was the man who could not be killed, the man who came back from the dead, the man whose hatred of Spain was so intense that death itself could not contain it. And now he began the series of expeditions that would make his name echo through centuries. He sacked Puerto Caballos, a harbor town on the coast of Honduras. He took Gibraltar and Maracaibo, the raids we have already traced. He accumulated wealth in quantities that seemed impossible for a man who had arrived in the Caribbean with nothing but his servitude. But always, behind the accumulation, there was something else, a quality that Exquemelin and others could not quite name, but tried repeatedly to describe. A pleasure in pain that exceeded any practical purpose, an appetite for suffering that seemed to transcend mere cruelty and become something else entirely. The stories accumulated. The prisoner whose tongue was pulled out because he would not reveal the location of treasure that probably did not exist. The prisoners forced to watch as one of their number was hacked apart piece by piece as an incentive for the others to talk. The man, and this story Exquemelin tells with what seems like horrified fascination, whose chest Lolonais cut open while he still lived, from whose body Lolonais extracted the still-beating heart and gnawed upon it before the dying man's eyes. Did this happen? We cannot know with certainty. Exquemelin was not always present at the events he describes. He was working from second-hand accounts, from stories told by men who had every reason to exaggerate both their successes and their atrocities. The Buccaneers lived in a culture of competitive bragging. A reputation for extreme violence was currency in that world. But something about Lolonais was different. Other buccaneers were cruel. Other buccaneers tortured and killed. But they did not become synonymous with cruelty itself. They did not inspire the same visceral horror in the Spanish colonial imagination. If Lolonai's reputation was merely manufactured, why did his manufacture succeed so spectacularly when others did not? The most plausible answer is that the reputation was rooted in reality, not necessarily in every specific incident. Excamelin may have attributed to Lolonais things done by others, or may have embellished beyond what actually occurred, but in a general pattern of behavior that his contemporaries recognized and documented. Lolonais was extreme even by the extreme standards of his time and place. He stood out from a crowd of violent men as the most violent among them. What made him this way? The question is unanswerable with the sources available. We can speculate about the trauma of his indenture, about psychological damage sustained in those years of unfree labor under brutal masters. We can speculate about some innate tendency, some wiring of the brain that made suffering interesting to him. We can speculate about the logic of escalation, the way that violence, once begun, demands ever greater intensities to achieve the same effects. But speculation is not knowledge. The inner life of Jean-David now remains as opaque as the inner life of anyone who died 4 centuries ago without leaving journals or letters or intimate correspondence. We have his actions. We have the accounts of others. We have the legend. We do not have the man. What we do have is the Caribbean he moved through, and that Caribbean can tell us something. The world that produced Lolonais was not incidentally violent. It was constitutively violent. Violence was not a failure of the system, but the system's operating principle. The sugar that sweetened European tea was produced through slavery, through the systematic destruction of human beings converted into labor. The silver that flowed from American mines to Spanish coffers was extracted by forced labor that killed workers by the hundreds of thousands. The trade routes that connected these productive sites to European markets were maintained by naval power, by cannon and musket, and the threat of death. Lolonais did not introduce violence into this world. He simply performed it with unusual enthusiasm. He simply stripped away the bureaucratic pretenses that made imperial violence seem legitimate and revealed the raw brutality underneath. When he tortured a Spanish prisoner, he was doing at the individual level what the encomienda system did at the institutional level. When he extracted wealth through fear and pain, he was following the logic that underlay the entire colonial enterprise. This does not excuse him. Nothing excuses the specific cruelties he inflicted on specific human beings, but it contextualizes him. It places him within a system that his actions simultaneously revealed and replicated. He was not an aberration, but a symptom. He was what the colonial Caribbean looked like when you removed the paperwork. The Spanish authorities understood this, in their way. Their horror at Lolonais was genuine, but it was also selective. They were horrified by what he did to Spanish subjects while remaining largely untroubled by what they did to indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans. The violence they condemned in the Buccaneers was violence they practiced themselves under different names and through different instruments. Lolonais simply made it impossible to ignore. And this, perhaps, is why his legend endured while others faded. He was uncomfortable. He was unforgettable. He forced observers to confront things they preferred to leave unexamined. The extreme nature of his cruelty made it visible in a way that institutional cruelty was not. You could look away from a sugar plantation's regularized torture of workers. You could not look away from a man eating a still-beating heart. The trajectory of his career after Maracaibo was, in retrospect, one of diminishing returns. He had achieved the impossible, the sack of a major Spanish lake system, the extraction of wealth that made him temporarily rich, the humiliation of Spanish arms before the watching eyes of the Caribbean. Where do you go after that? He went to Nicaragua. This was the expedition that would destroy him, though he could not have known it at the start. He gathered his fleet, 4 ships, perhaps 5, with several hundred men. He sailed south toward the Central American coast, toward the Gulf of Honduras and the rivers that led into the interior. He was looking for new sources of plunder, new towns to sack, new victims to terrorize. But the expedition went wrong from the beginning. The winds were unfavorable. The currents fought against them. What should have taken weeks stretched into months. Supplies ran short. Men began to sicken. The concentrated force that had taken Maracaibo was dispersing, leaking strength with every passing day. They reached the coast. They attempted their inland march. But the geography of Nicaragua was not the geography of Lake Maracaibo. Here there were no wide waters to navigate, no established towns with concentrated wealth. Here there were forests that swallowed men, rivers that led nowhere, indigenous peoples who knew the terrain and used it against the invaders. The Spanish had learned from Maracaibo. Word had spread throughout the colonial administration. Lawless is coming. This time they were prepared. They had reinforced the garrisons. They had moved treasure to more defensible locations. They had armed the native auxiliaries and positioned them to harass the Buccaneers at every turn. Lawless' men began to die, not in battle primarily, though there were skirmishes, ambushes, running fights through jungle terrain. They died of disease. They died of starvation. They died of injuries that could not be treated in the field. The expedition that had set out with such confidence began to fragment. And here, in the disintegration, we see something that the legend of Lawless usually obscures. He was not invincible. He was not even, in the final analysis, particularly competent at managing the logistics of sustained operations. His genius, if we can call it that, was for the concentrated assault, the sudden overwhelming strike that broke resistance before it could organize. He was a berserker, not a general. And when the conditions that favored his style of warfare were absent, he had nothing to fall back on. The expedition limped southward, then eastward, searching for escape routes, for ships, for any path back to safety. They found none. The fleet was gone, scattered, sunk, captured. The men were dying. And Lawless himself, the most feared man in the Caribbean, was reduced to struggling through jungle on foot, leading a shrinking band of survivors toward a coast he hoped would offer rescue. The coast offered nothing. They emerged from the tree line onto beaches that stretched empty in both directions, the Caribbean spreading before them like a mockery of freedom. There were no ships. There were no settlements. There was only sand and surf, and the humid weight of air that pressed down on men already broken by weeks of jungle travel. Lawless counted his remaining force. The numbers had become obscene. Of the several hundred who had set out from Tortuga with dreams of Nicaraguan gold, fewer than 100 remained capable of walking. Perhaps fewer than that. The sources are vague here, as they often are when describing failure. Success generates documentation. Catastrophe generates silence. They needed boats. Without boats, they were simply marooned, stranded on a hostile coast, hundreds of miles from any friendly port, with Spanish patrols surely searching for them and indigenous populations who had no reason to offer aid. Lawless made a decision that would have seemed reasonable under the circumstances, though it would prove fatal. He ordered his men to build canoes. This was not impossible. The Buccaneers included men who had lived among the coastal peoples, who knew how dugouts were made, who had the skills to fell trees and hollow them with fire and adze. But it took time. Time they did not have. Time during which their numbers continued to dwindle, their supplies continued to vanish, their cohesion as a fighting force continued to dissolve. They worked. The canoes took shape, crude vessels, barely seaworthy, capable of hugging the coastline but useless for open water crossings. Lawless loaded his survivors into these makeshift craft and began paddling eastward, following the curve of the Central American coast toward what he hoped would be salvation. The journey was a slow-motion disaster. They could not carry enough food. They could not move fast enough to outrun pursuit. They could not find reliable sources of fresh water. Each day brought new deaths, men who simply stopped paddling and slumped over, men who crawled onto beaches during rest stops and did not rise again, men who slipped beneath the waves during night crossings and were not retrieved. The most feared pirate in the Caribbean was dying by inches, and there was nothing his reputation could do to stop it. It was somewhere along the coast of Darien, the narrow isthmus connecting Central and South America, a region of dense jungle and scattered indigenous communities, that the final act began. The precise location is lost. The precise date is uncertain. What we know is that Lawless and his remaining men, perhaps 2 or 3 dozen at this point, perhaps fewer, made landfall in territory controlled by a people the Spanish called the Cuna. The Cuna had dealt with Europeans before. They had dealt with Spanish missionaries who came to save their souls and Spanish soldiers who came to steal their labor. They had dealt with buccaneers who sailed into their waters seeking fresh food and information about Spanish movements. They had learned, through decades of brutal experience, that Europeans were dangerous, unpredictable, and generally best avoided. But Lolonais was not in a position to be avoided. He was in a position of desperate need. His men were starving, dying, incapable of defending themselves against a serious attack. He needed food. He needed shelter. He needed time to recover, to find a ship, to somehow extract himself from this catastrophe and return to Tortuga, where he could rebuild his reputation and his fleet. What happened next depends on which source you trust. Some accounts suggest that Lolonais attempted to negotiate with the Cuna, offering trade goods or future consideration in exchange for assistance. Others suggest that he attempted to take what he needed by force, falling back on the tactics that had worked so well against Spanish colonists. Still others suggest that the Cuna needed no provocation, that they recognized the weakness of these men and saw an opportunity for revenge against a category of people who had brought them nothing but suffering. What all the sources agree on is the outcome. The Cuna captured Lolonais. They captured what remained of his men. And then, according to the most detailed accounts that reached Tortuga months or years later through uncertain channels, they killed him in a manner that matched his own reputation for cruelty. They dismembered him while he was still alive. The details vary. Some versions say they cut off his limbs one by one. Some say they burned pieces of him. Some say they ate parts of his body, either as an act of ritual significance or as a deliberate mirror of the story, by then widely known throughout the Caribbean, of what he had done to the Spanish prisoner whose heart he had bitten. The symmetry was too perfect to be coincidental. The man who had terrorized the Spanish by eating a still-beating heart was himself eaten by people he had presumed to dominate. Whether this account is literally true is impossible to verify. The sources are late, second-hand, filtered through multiple retellings. Indigenous practices of the period are poorly documented and easily distorted by European prejudices that assumed cannibalism wherever violence occurred. It is entirely possible that the Cuna simply killed Lolonais and his men in whatever manner seemed most practical, and that the story of dismemberment and consumption was added later by narrators who wanted the villain to receive a villain's end. But even if the specific details are legendary rather than literal, the broad shape is clear. Lolonais died in the Darien jungle, killed by indigenous people he had underestimated, his body disposed of in a manner that left nothing for burial or recovery. He simply vanished. The most feared man in the Caribbean became, in his final moments, merely another European who had wandered into territory he did not understand and been swallowed by it. The sea does not remember him. The jungle does not remember him. Only the stories remain. And here, we must pause to consider what kind of story this actually is, because the legend of Lolonais, as it has been transmitted through the centuries, has a shape that feels almost too neat. The torturer tortured, the cannibal cannibalized, the monster destroyed by monsters. It is a narrative of poetic justice, a fable of retribution, a tale that seems designed to satisfy our desire for moral balance in a universe that rarely provides it. This neatness should make us suspicious. History is not a morality play. Events do not arrange themselves to punish the wicked and reward the virtuous. The fact that Lolonais' death so perfectly mirrors his crimes suggests that someone, somewhere in the chain of transmission, shaped the story to fit expectations. Perhaps the Cuna themselves, aware of his reputation, chose to kill him in a manner that would resonate with European fears. Perhaps the buccaneers who survived and escaped embellished the tale to make their former captain's end more dramatic. Perhaps Excamla, writing years later, selected and arranged details to create the symmetry his readers would find satisfying. We cannot know. What we can know is that Lolonais died somewhere in the Darien, sometime in 1668 or perhaps early 69, and that his body was never recovered. His career had lasted perhaps 5 years at its peak, from his first successful raids out of Tortuga to the disaster in Nicaragua. 5 years in which he accumulated more terror, more notoriety, more concentrated violence than men who lived 3 times as long. 5 years. It seems impossible that so much could fit into so little time. But the Caribbean of the 1660s was a compressed world, a hothouse of violence where careers rose and fell with the speed of fever dreams. Men arrived from Europe with nothing and became wealthy within months. Men who seemed invincible were dead before the year was out. L'Ollonais was not exceptional in the brevity of his career, only in its intensity. The news of his death filtered back to Tortuga slowly. Ships arrived with fragments of information, a survivor picked up by a passing vessel, a Spanish dispatch intercepted and decoded, a rumor that circulated through the taverns of the port. At first, no one believed it. L'Ollonais had survived so many things that should have killed him. The shipwreck on Campeche, the Spanish soldiers who thought they had finished him, the battles where men died on either side of him while he emerged untouched. Surely he would survive this too. But the weeks became months, and no word came. No fleet appeared on the horizon bearing the black flag that meant L'Ollonais was returning with plunder. The creditors who had financed his Nicaragua expedition began to accept that they would never see their investment returned. The merchants who had sold him supplies wrote off the debts. The women who had waited for particular men to return stopped waiting. Tortuga absorbed the loss as it absorbed all losses, quickly, without sentiment, with immediate attention to who would fill the vacuum. There were other captains, there were other ships, there were other expeditions being planned, even as L'Ollonais rotted in a jungle clearing 1,000 miles away. The economy of piracy did not pause to mourn its most famous practitioner. And yet, something had shifted. The period after L'Ollonais' death was, in retrospect, the beginning of the end for the buccaneering era in its pure form. Not immediately. There were still major expeditions, still spectacular successes, still men who made fortunes from Spanish plunder. Henry Morgan was still rising toward his greatest achievement, the sack of Panama, which would dwarf even Maracaibo in its scale and audacity. The Caribbean was still ungoverned, still violent, still a theater of possibility for men willing to risk everything. But the pressures that would eventually end buccaneering were already building. The great powers of Europe were beginning to see the value of regulated trade over piratical chaos. Colonial administrators were beginning to receive instructions to rein in the privateers, to enforce treaty obligations, to transform the Caribbean from a war zone into a commercial zone. The political cover that had protected men like L'Ollonais, the tacit understanding that they served English and French interests by harrying the Spanish, was starting to fray. None of this was visible from the deck of a ship in 1669. None of this would have mattered to a buccaneer loading cannon and preparing for his next raid. History is invisible to those who live it. The men who gathered in Tortuga's taverns in the months after L'Ollonais' disappearance were not thinking about geopolitical trends or the future of Caribbean commerce. They were thinking about Spanish shipping routes and undefended ports and the possibility of wealth that lay just over the horizon. But we, looking back, can see what they could not. We can see that L'Ollonais represented something that was already passing, the pure, unmediated violence of the early buccaneering era, before Henry Morgan transformed piracy into something more organized and more politically sophisticated, before the great powers imposed their treaties and their regulations, before the wild Caribbean was tamed into the plantation economy that would define the next 2 centuries. L'Ollonais was not a pirate of the future. He was a pirate of the ending present. He was the logical culmination of everything that the buccaneering system had been designed to produce. A man of absolute violence, untroubled by law or mercy, using terror as his primary weapon because terror was what the circumstances demanded. He did not innovate. He did not build institutions. He did not leave behind a fleet or a code or a system that others could inherit. He left behind only stories, only fear, only the memory of what unrestrained human cruelty could accomplish when all external constraints were removed. The question of legacy is complicated by the question of sources. Almost everything we know about L'Ollonais comes from a single book, Alexandre Exquemelin's The Buccaneers of America. First published in Dutch in 1678, then translated into Spanish, English, French, and German in editions that varied significantly from one another. Exquemelin was himself a buccaneer, or at least traveled with buccaneers as a ship's surgeon. He claimed to have participated in some of the expeditions he described. He claimed personal knowledge of some of the men whose lives he narrated. Whether these claims are reliable is impossible to determine at this distance. Exquemelin had commercial incentives to make his book as dramatic as possible. The accounts of Lolonai's cruelties, the heart-eating, the tongue-pulling, the systematic torture, were exactly the kind of material that would sell books to a European audience hungry for tales of exotic violence. It is entirely possible that Exquemelin exaggerated, embellished, or simply invented details that he thought would appeal to his readers. But it is also possible that he told the truth. The Caribbean of the 1660s was a place where the things he described could have happened. The institutional framework that might have prevented such atrocities did not exist. The moral consensus that might have condemned them was weak at best. Lolonais operated in a context where cruelty was not aberrant but functional, where terror served purposes that gentler methods could not achieve. If his reported behavior seems excessive by our standards, we must remember that our standards were not the standards of his world. The Spanish sources, depositions, administrative reports, letters to and from colonial officials generally corroborate the broad outlines of Exquemelin's account, even if they differ on specific details. They confirm that Lolonais existed. They confirm that he raided Maracaibo and Gibraltar. They confirm that he was known for exceptional brutality, even by the standards of a brutal era. They do not, for the most part, contain the specific torture scenes that make Exquemelin's account so memorable. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Spanish officials had reasons not to dwell on the details of atrocities committed against their subjects. Such details were humiliating. They suggested failure to protect. They raised uncomfortable questions about colonial administration. What we are left with, then, is a figure who exists somewhere in the uncertain space between history and legend. The basic facts are probably true. He was French, he lived in Hispaniola, he became a buccaneer. He led the Maracaibo expedition. He died in the Darien jungle. The specific details, the hearts, the tongues, the flesh eaten in front of dying men, are possible but unverifiable. They feel true in the sense that they fit everything we know about the context in which he operated. But feeling true and being true are not the same thing. Perhaps it does not matter. Perhaps the Lolonais who exists in the historical record is less important than the Lolonais who exists in collective memory, the symbol, the warning, the embodiment of what happens when violence is given free rein. Real people become legendary figures, not because of who they actually were, but because of who they come to represent. Lolonais has come to represent the outer limit of buccaneering cruelty, the point beyond which even pirates hesitated to go. Whether he actually occupied that position in life or was placed there by later storytellers is, in some sense, irrelevant to his cultural function. He serves as a boundary marker. When we tell stories about the golden age of piracy, when we romanticize the freedom of men who lived outside the law, when we imagine the Caribbean as a space of adventure and possibility, Lolonais stands at the edge of that imagination as a reminder of what it actually meant. Not just freedom, but violence without limit. Not just adventure, but atrocity. Not just possibility, but the possibility of becoming something less than human. The romanticization of piracy that would flourish in later centuries, in novels, in plays, in films, in the collective fantasy of Western culture, would largely ignore figures like Lolonais. It would prefer figures like Henry Morgan, who could be portrayed as a gentleman rogue, or the fictional pirates of Treasure Island and Peter Pan, who were dangerous but also somehow charming. Lolonais resisted romanticization. He was too dark, too serious, too disturbing to fit the template of the lovable scoundrel. He reminded audiences of things they would prefer to forget. And this, perhaps, is his truest legacy. Not the gold he took from Maracaibo, not the ships he captured or the towns he burned, but the discomfort he still produces 4 centuries later when we try to make sense of what he was. He resists our attempts to categorize him, to explain him, to contain him within moral or historical frameworks that make us feel comfortable. He simply was what he was, a man of extraordinary violence, produced by a system of extraordinary violence, destroyed by a violence he had assumed would always flow in one direction. The jungle reclaimed his body. The sea reclaimed the ships he once commanded. Time reclaimed the ports he terrorized, transforming Maracaibo and Gibraltar from wounded colonial towns into modern cities that bear no visible scars of what happened there in 1667. The world moved on. It always does. But the stories persisted. They crossed oceans in the pages of Exquemelin's book. They were repeated in taverns and drawing rooms across Europe. They became part of the mythology of the Caribbean, the dark matter around which the brighter legends of piracy would eventually orbit. And here we are, still telling them. Still trying to understand a man who died in a jungle clearing more than 350 years ago, eaten or not eaten by people whose names we do not know, leaving behind nothing but the echo of screams. The Kuna who killed him, whoever they were, whatever their reasons, left no written record. Their perspective on these events exists only in fragments of oral tradition that may or may not have survived to the present day. They saw Lolone not as a legendary figure or a symbol of anything larger, but simply as an intruder, a threat, a problem to be solved. They solved it. They went on with their lives. The jungle closed over the place where he died, and within a generation, the exact location was lost. He had wanted to be remembered. Every act of theatrical cruelty, every display of impossible daring, every gesture calculated to terrify and impress, these were not merely tactical choices, but also bids for immortality. He was building a legend while he lived, constructing a reputation that would survive his death. And in this, at least, he succeeded. He got what he wanted. His name still carries weight. His story still gets told. But the immortality of legend is not the same as the immortality of understanding. We know his name. We know his deeds, or the deeds attributed to him. We know the shape of his career and the manner of his death. What we do not know, what we can never know, is what it was like to be him. What he thought as he watched men die under his hands. What he felt as he bit into a human heart. Whether he experienced his own cruelty as pleasure or as necessity, or as something beyond our categories of explanation entirely. The sources give us actions without interiority. They give us a monster without a psychology. And perhaps this is fitting. Perhaps some forms of violence are precisely those that resist psychological explanation, that cannot be reduced to trauma or circumstances or comprehensible motivation. Perhaps Lolone was simply what he appeared to be, a man who discovered that he was capable of anything and who pursued that capability to its logical end. The logical end. It is a phrase that assumes logic was operating, that there was a trajectory, a through line, a calculus beneath the carnage. And perhaps there was. Or perhaps the phrase is simply the best we can do when confronted with a life that seems to defy the categories we bring to it. Either way, the end itself was anything but logical. It was chaotic, improvised, a series of desperate calculations made by a man whose instrument of survival, terror, had finally failed to produce the results it once guaranteed. But before we arrive at that final unraveling, we must understand what preceded it. The months between the triumph at Maracaibo and the disaster on the Darien coast were not empty. They were filled with motion, with planning, with the slow accumulation of circumstances that would make the disaster not just possible, but perhaps inevitable. Lolone did not simply fall from power. He walked, step by step, into a trap of his own making. And to understand how, we must return to the world he inhabited after Gibraltar, to the position he occupied at the apex of buccaneering society, and to the choices he made from that precarious height. The return to Tortuga in late 1667 was a triumph. 8 ships, perhaps 600 men still alive, holds stuffed with silver, with goods, with the portable wealth of 2 ransacked cities. Lolone had accomplished what no buccaneer before him had managed, a sustained campaign deep into Spanish colonial territory, culminating in the sack of not 1, but 2 significant towns. The total value of the plunder was staggering. Exquemelin places it at approximately 260,000 pieces of 8, though this figure, like all figures from the period, must be treated with caution. What is certain is that it was enough to make every man in the expedition substantially richer than he had been, enough to establish Lolonais as the most successful pirate captain then operating in the Caribbean, enough to guarantee that when he next called for volunteers, men would come running. And they did. Within months of his return, Lolonais was planning another expedition, this one even more ambitious than the last. The target was the Spanish Main, not the Venezuelan coast he had already ravaged, but the settlements of Central America, the ports and towns strung along the coast from Honduras to Panama. The prize he sought was not merely silver, but something rarer and more valuable, the actual source of Spanish wealth: the mines. The places where precious metals emerged from the earth before beginning their long journey to Seville. If he could reach these places, if he could strike at the foundation rather than merely intercepting the flow, the rewards would be beyond calculation. It was a fantasy, of course. The mines of Spanish America were not located conveniently near the coast. They were inland, protected by distance, by terrain, by colonial populations who had no intention of allowing buccaneers to simply walk in and help themselves. But Lolonais had accomplished the impossible before. He had broken the defenses of Lake Maracaibo. He had held 2 cities hostage. He had tortured Spanish soldiers until they told him everything he wanted to know. Why should Honduras be different? Why should Panama be beyond his reach? The expedition that assembled at Tortuga in the spring of 1668 was smaller than the Maracaibo fleet, but still substantial: 6 ships, perhaps 700 men. Lolonais commanded from a vessel larger than any he had captained before, a Spanish prize converted to his purposes, its guns augmented, its hold prepared for the treasure he expected to acquire. Among his captains was Moses Vauquelin, a fellow Frenchman who had proven himself in the Maracaibo campaign. The crew was a mixture of veterans from the earlier expedition and new recruits drawn by the promise of riches and the magnetic pull of Lolonais' reputation. They were, by all accounts, enthusiastic. They were also, in ways they could not have anticipated, doomed. The problems began almost immediately. The fleet sailed southwest toward the Bay of Honduras, but the winds were unfavorable, the currents treacherous. What should have been a journey of weeks stretched into months. Supplies ran low. The men grew restless, then hungry, then desperate. Lolonais, who had demonstrated such tactical brilliance at Maracaibo, seemed unable to adapt to the changed circumstances. He had planned for a quick strike, a lightning raid that would catch the Spanish off guard. Instead, he found himself becalmed, drifting, watching his expedition dissolve before it had properly begun. They put in at various points along the coast to hunt for food and water. The pattern that emerges from the sources is one of increasing desperation. The grand ambitions of the expedition contracted day by day into the simpler problem of survival. The men who had signed on expecting wealth found themselves foraging for wild pigs and sea turtles, scraping together enough calories to keep the expedition moving. And with each delay, each setback, the cohesion that had held the fleet together began to weaken. The buccaneering system depended on success. Men followed captains who delivered results. They stayed loyal as long as the equation remained favorable. Risk balanced against reward, danger weighed against profit. But when the profits failed to materialize, when the dangers multiplied without corresponding compensation, the calculations shifted. Murmuring began. Questions were asked. Men looked at Lolonais with eyes that no longer held the same mixture of fear and admiration. They had seen him at the height of his power, and now they were seeing something else. A man whose luck might be running out, a captain whose judgment might be failing. Lolonais responded the only way he knew how. He pushed forward. Somewhere along the coast of Honduras, the expedition made landfall near an indigenous settlement and demanded provisions. When the locals proved unable or unwilling to supply what was demanded, Lolonais ordered the village destroyed. There was no tactical purpose to this violence, no strategic gain. It was simply the reflex of a man who had built his career on terror, applying terror to a situation where it served no function except to express his frustration. The village burned. The people fled or died. And the expedition moved on, no better supplied than before, but now with another atrocity added to its account: the sources become confused here, fragmentary. Exquemelin was not present for much of what followed, and his account is based on second-hand reports from survivors whose memories were shaped by trauma and the passage of time. What we can piece together is this: the expedition fractured. At some point during the disastrous Honduras campaign, portions of the fleet separated from Lolonai's command. Moses Vuccaneer took his ship and his men and struck out on his own, apparently unwilling to continue following a leader who seemed to be leading them nowhere. Other captains did the same. The grand fleet of 700 men shrank, ship by ship, until Lolonais found himself commanding a single vessel with perhaps 400 men still under his authority. These were the most loyal, or the most desperate, or perhaps simply those who had no better options. They stayed with the man who had made them rich once before, hoping he could do it again. He could not. The remaining ship continued south, toward the coast of what is now Nicaragua, then farther, toward the Isthmus of Darien. The exact route is impossible to reconstruct with certainty. The expedition was no longer following a plan. It was drifting, improvising, searching for any opportunity that might salvage something from the wreckage of its ambitions. At some point, the ship ran aground. The sources differ on whether this was due to navigational error, storm damage, or simple bad luck. What is certain is that the vessel that had carried Lolonais from Tortuga, the converted Spanish prize that had been the flagship of his grand expedition, became immobile, useless, a rotting hulk stuck fast on a sandbar or reef somewhere along that fever-haunted coast. They were marooned, not on a picturesque island of the kind that populates pirate fiction, but on the edge of one of the most hostile environments in the Western Hemisphere. The Darien coast was dense jungle, a wall of green that began at the waterline and stretched inland as far as anyone could penetrate. The heat was brutal, the humidity suffocating. Insects swarmed in clouds, the water was brackish or contaminated, and the indigenous people of the region, the Kuna primarily, along with other groups whose names have been lost, had no reason to welcome European intruders and many reasons to resist them. Lolonais was not accustomed to being prey. He had spent his career cultivating terror, projecting an image of unstoppable violence that made resistance seem futile. But that image depended on context. It required ships and guns, armed men in formation, the visible apparatus of buccaneering power. On the deck of a captured vessel, or in the streets of a conquered town, Lolonais was a nightmare given human form. But in the jungle, stripped of his fleet, his men weakened by hunger and disease, he was simply another vulnerable body among bodies. The expedition tried to move inland. The logic, such as it was, seems to have been that salvation lay somewhere beyond the coast, perhaps a Spanish settlement that could be raided, perhaps a route across the isthmus to Panama. But the jungle resisted them at every step. The terrain was nearly impassable, a chaos of roots and vines and standing water. The heat sapped their strength. The food they could find, fruits they did not recognize, animals they could not easily catch, was inadequate to sustain men already weakened by months of deprivation. And the Kuna were watching. We know almost nothing about the specific people who killed Lolonais. The Kuna had inhabited the Darien region for centuries before European contact. They were skilled at living in an environment that Europeans found utterly hostile, and they had developed effective strategies for dealing with intruders. By the 1660s, they had experienced decades of Spanish colonial presence and had learned that Europeans could be resisted, could be killed, could be made to understand that the jungle was not theirs to take. They observed the buccaneers struggling through their territory, and they waited for the right moment. The details of what followed are almost entirely conjectural. Exquemelin reports that the indigenous people captured Lolonais and his men, that they killed them in gruesome fashion, and that Lolonais himself was dismembered and, in some versions, eaten. But Exquemelin was not there. His account is based on rumors that reached Tortuga months or years later, filtered through the particular expectations and fantasies of a European audience that assumed all indigenous peoples practiced cannibalism and barbarism. The truth may have been more mundane. The buccaneers may simply have been killed, their bodies left in the jungle to decompose. The cannibalism may be a European invention, a way of making the death of such a notorious figure appropriately dramatic, or it may be true. The Kuna and other groups in the region did, in certain circumstances, practice ritual cannibalism, though the evidence for this is itself contested and shaped by colonial biases. And there is a particular appropriateness to the idea that a man who had eaten a human heart would himself be eaten in turn. The narrative symmetry is almost too perfect, which is precisely why we should be suspicious of it. History rarely arranges itself into such neat patterns. When it seems to, we are often looking at myth rather than fact. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: François Lolonais died somewhere on the Darien coast, probably in late 1668 or early 1669, in circumstances that were violent and that left no witnesses who later communicated with European chroniclers. His body was not recovered, no grave was dug, no marker was placed. The jungle took him, as it took so many others. Spanish soldiers and English privateers and French buccaneers and countless indigenous people whose deaths went unrecorded by anyone. He became, in the most literal sense, part of the landscape he had tried to dominate. His bones, if they survived at all, were scattered by scavengers and dissolved by the humid chemistry of tropical decay. Within a few years, there was nothing left to find, even if anyone had wanted to find it. The news reached Tortuga eventually. Survivors of the expedition, there must have been some, though the sources do not tell us how many, made their way back to the settlements of Hispaniola and told their stories. The details varied. The cannibalism may have been added in the telling, each narrator embellishing the story to make it more dramatic, more worthy of the legend they were narrating. But the essential fact was clear. Lolonais was dead. The man who had seemed unstoppable, whose very name had made Spanish colonists tremble, had been stopped in the most final way possible. The reaction on Tortuga appears to have been muted. There were no elaborate mourning ceremonies, no memorials, no public acknowledgments of what had been lost. The Buccaneers were practical people. They mourned their dead with rum and moved on to the next captain, the next expedition, the next opportunity. Lolonais had been useful while he lived, but his usefulness was over. The ships he had commanded were gone, dispersed among other captains, or lost to the sea. The men who had followed him were dead or scattered or already serving under new leaders. The world of Caribbean piracy continued without him, as it had continued before him, as it would continue long after the last man who remembered him had died. And yet the story persisted. Exquemelin's book, first published in Dutch in 1678 and quickly translated into English, French, and Spanish, ensured that Lolonais would not be forgotten. The account is vivid, detailed, and almost certainly shaped by the conventions of the genre, the sensationalized travel narrative that European readers consumed with such appetite in the 17th and 18th centuries. But it was based on something real. Exquemelin had known men who had sailed with Lolonais, had heard their stories, had perhaps seen with his own eyes the prisoners who had been tortured and the towns that had been sacked. The core of the narrative, however embroidered, was anchored in events that actually occurred. The book made Lolonais famous in a way that his living exploits never had. He became a figure of European imagination, a symbol of the lawless violence that supposedly characterized the New World. He appeared in subsequent histories, in plays, in novels, each retelling adding new layers of myth to the foundation Exquemelin had provided. By the 19th century, when the romantic image of the pirate was being elaborated for popular consumption, Lolonais was firmly established as a figure in the canon, though always with that troubling quality that set him apart from the more palatable pirates. He was too dark, too cruel, too difficult to transform into a hero, even an anti-hero. This is where we must pause to consider what Lolonais actually represented and why his story continues to demand telling. He was not unique. The Caribbean of the 17th century produced many violent men, many pirates and buccaneers who killed without apparent compunction and accumulated fortunes through terror. Henry Morgan, who would sack Panama just a few years after Lolonais' death, employed methods that were, in their own way, equally brutal. The difference was one of style, of presentation, of the particular quality of cruelty that each man brought to his work. Morgan was strategic, calculated, capable of presenting his violence as a regrettable necessity in service of English national interests. L'Ollonais made no such pretense. His violence was personal, intimate, performative. He wanted his enemies to see him enjoying their destruction. This distinction matters because it reveals something about the limits of historical sympathy. We can, with effort, understand violence that presents itself as instrumental, as a means to an end. We can contextualize it, explain it, perhaps even justify it under certain circumstances. But violence that presents itself as an end in itself, violence that the perpetrator seems to enjoy for its own sake, this remains resistant to our categories. It troubles us. It suggests possibilities about human nature that we would prefer not to contemplate, and so we push figures like L'Ollonais to the margins, acknowledging their existence but declining to examine them too closely. But the marginalization is itself a distortion. L'Ollonais was not an aberration. He was a product. The system that created him, the plantation economies of the Caribbean, the slave trade, the perpetual imperial warfare, the brutal labor regimes that consumed human bodies like fuel, was built on violence that makes his personal cruelties look almost modest in comparison. The Spanish colonists he tortured had themselves presided over the enslavement and destruction of indigenous populations on a scale that defies comprehension. The French officials who nominally governed Tortuga had enriched themselves through human trafficking. The entire structure of the colonial Caribbean was a machine for converting human suffering into European wealth. L'Ollonais worked within that machine. He used its tools. He found perhaps that he had a talent for its characteristic operations, but he did not create it, and he was not its most destructive participant. The horror he provokes in us is not proportional to the actual harm he caused, which, terrible as it was, affected hundreds of victims, not millions. The horror is about something else. It is about the intimacy of his violence, the way he forced his victims to experience their destruction at close range, the way he made the impersonal brutality of the colonial system suddenly, unbearably personal. And perhaps this is why we remember him when we have forgotten so many others. He made the violence visible. He stripped away the legitimating discourses of empire and commerce and religion and showed what lay beneath. Human beings hurting other human beings because they could, because there was profit in it, because no one was going to stop them. His crimes were not different in kind from the crimes of the colonial system. They were only different in the sense that he refused to pretend they were anything other than what they were. The jungle closed over him. The tides washed the beaches where his ship had run aground. The Kuna returned to their settlements and continued their lives, perhaps telling stories about the strange, violent men who had come from the sea and been destroyed. Time passed. The 17th century became the 18th, the 18th the 19th. The colonial world that had produced L'Ollonais was dismantled, transformed, replaced by new configurations of power that had their own violences, their own cruelties, their own men who discovered what they were capable of. The Caribbean changed beyond recognition. The forests were cleared. The plantations rose and fell. The descendants of enslaved Africans became the majority populations of islands where their ancestors had been worked to death. And still the story persisted. Still there was this man, this name, this collection of atrocities attributed to a figure who had died in circumstances no one could verify, whose bones had returned to the earth centuries ago. The persistence is itself a kind of evidence. It tells us that something in the story continues to resonate, continues to demand attention, continues to resist the forces of forgetting that have erased so many other figures from the same period. What was it about this particular man, this particular collection of horrors that lodged so firmly in the collective memory? The question has no single answer, but it deserves to be asked. Part of it, surely, was the documentation. Exquemelin's account, whatever its limitations, gave L'Ollonais a narrative coherence that most buccaneers never received. His story had a beginning, a middle, and an end. It had memorable scenes, quotable atrocities, a trajectory that could be followed and retold. The pirates who died anonymously in tavern brawls or slipped beneath the waves in forgotten storms left no such legacy. They were absorbed back into the general violence of the age. Lawless, by the accident of having a chronicler who sailed with him, became a character in a story rather than merely a statistic. But documentation alone does not explain the persistence. Plenty of documented figures have been forgotten. There must be something in the story itself, something that speaks to concerns that transcend the particular circumstances of the 17th century Caribbean. Consider the Ark. A man is born into poverty, subjected to brutal treatment, stripped of everything that might connect him to conventional human society. He discovers that he has a capacity for violence that exceeds anything his oppressors imagined. He turns that capacity against the system that created him, but in doing so, he does not escape that system. He becomes its most perfect expression. He rises, he accumulates power, he becomes legendary. And then, at the height of his power, nature and chance intervene. His ship runs aground. The jungle swallows him. The people he sought to exploit destroy him instead. His body is consumed. Nothing remains. It is a story about the costs of becoming a monster. It is a story about the impossibility of escaping the systems that form us. It is a story about hubris and nemesis, about the jungle taking back what civilization tried to steal. And it is a story, finally, about consumption, about how the colonial world consumed human bodies for profit, and how, in the end, one of its most enthusiastic consumers was himself consumed. The symbolism is almost too neat. The man who had eaten the heart of his victim was himself eaten. The man who had dismembered prisoners was himself dismembered. The man who had transformed human beings into raw material for his own advancement became, in the end, raw material for someone else's survival. Whether or not the details are accurate, and we have no way of knowing, the shape of the story has a kind of moral logic that explains its persistence. It feels like justice, or something that wears justice's face. But we should be careful about that feeling. The satisfaction we take in Lawless's end tells us something about ourselves, about our need for narrative closure, about our desire to see cruelty punished even when we know that cruelty often goes unpunished, that most of the perpetrators of the colonial atrocities died peacefully in their beds, that the victims rarely received any kind of cosmic vindication. Lawless's death flatters our moral intuitions. It lets us believe that the universe bends toward justice, and precisely because it flatters us, we should examine it skeptically. The Kuna who killed him, if they killed him, were not agents of cosmic justice. They were people defending their territory against invaders, doing what was necessary to survive, using the tools available to them. To cast them as instruments of Lawless's deserved fate is to reduce them to supporting characters in his story, to deny them their own motivations and their own history. It is, in its way, another form of the colonial erasure that made Lawless possible in the first place. The Kuna were not punishing Lawless for his crimes against Spanish prisoners. They were protecting themselves against a threat. The moral satisfaction we feel at his death is our imposition, not theirs. And yet the story persists, and we persist in telling it, and something in it continues to demand attention. Perhaps what it demands is a reckoning with the ordinariness of atrocity. Lawless was not a demon. He was not possessed. He was not fundamentally different in kind from the other men who sailed with him, who participated in his raids, who watched his tortures and did not intervene. He was a human being who discovered, under the specific conditions of the 17th century Caribbean, what human beings are capable of when the constraints are removed. The horror he provokes is the horror of recognition. Not that we see ourselves in him. Most of us, mercifully, will never face circumstances that would reveal what we might do, but that we see the species in him. We see the possibilities that lurk in the structure of what we are. The buccaneers who served under Lawless were not, for the most part, sadists. They were men seeking profit, seeking adventure, seeking escape from circumstances that offered them little. They accepted Lawless's leadership because his methods worked, because his cruelty was effective, because fear was a weapon and he wielded it expertly. They participated in the system he created because the system delivered results. And when the results stopped coming, when the ships ran aground and the jungle closed in and the food ran out, they drifted away, seeking other leaders, other opportunities, other systems that might serve their needs. This is how atrocity usually works, not through demons, but through ordinary people making ordinary calculations about risk and reward, about belonging and exclusion, about what is permitted and what is required. The torturer is rarely a madman. More often, he is a professional doing what is expected of him, what the system has trained him to do, what his superiors have authorized and his peers have normalized. Lawless was unusual only in the degree to which he seemed to enjoy his work. The work itself was widespread. The Spanish officials who administered the colonial empire employed torture routinely. The Inquisition maintained detailed manuals for the infliction of suffering. The plantation owners of Hispaniola and Jamaica and Barbados developed sophisticated technologies for the control and punishment of enslaved workers. Brandings, whippings, mutilations, slow deaths designed to serve as warnings to others. The slave ships themselves were instruments of torture, their holds designed to maximize the number of human bodies that could be transported regardless of the suffering involved. Compared to the systematic, bureaucratic cruelty of the colonial enterprise, Lawless's personal atrocities were almost artisanal. He hurt people one at a time, with his own hands. The empires hurt them by the millions, through policies and procedures and investment portfolios. This is not to excuse Lawless. There is no excuse. It is simply to locate him accurately within the system that produced him. He was not an outsider. He was not a disruption. He was a particularly vivid expression of tendencies that ran throughout the colonial world. The difference was that he stripped away the justifications. He did not torture in the name of God or king or commerce. He tortured because he wanted to, because it worked, because no one could stop him. The honesty was more disturbing than the cruelty. The centuries have a way of softening things. The pirate has become a figure of romance, a symbol of freedom and adventure, a Halloween costume for children. The skull and crossbones flies from boats that have never seen combat, worn by people who have never faced the choices that actual pirates faced. The Caribbean itself has become a destination for tourists seeking sun and relaxation, its beaches cleansed of the history that soaked into them. The descendants of enslaved Africans serve drinks to the descendants of Europeans in resorts built on the ruins of plantation economies. The violence has been aestheticized, packaged, made safe for consumption. Lawless resists this process. He is not romantic. He cannot be softened. The details of what he did are too specific, too visceral, too resistant to euphemism. The tongue ripped from the living mouth, the heart torn from the open chest, the prisoners burned alive when they could not produce information they did not possess. These images do not lend themselves to children's costumes. They do not fit comfortably into the heritage tourism industry. They remain jagged, uncomfortable, impossible to assimilate into the narratives we tell ourselves about the past. And perhaps this is his value, not as a figure to admire or even to understand, but as a figure who disrupts the comfortable stories, who forces us to confront what the colonial Caribbean actually was, who makes it impossible to pretend that the violence was incidental rather than constitutive. He is a mirror, dark and distorted, but a mirror nonetheless. What we see in him is not him alone, it is the system that made him. It is the possibilities that exist in all of us. It is the cost of building worlds on the foundation of human suffering. The Darien jungle, where he died, still stands, though reduced, though fragmented, though threatened by the same forces of extraction and development that have transformed so much of the Caribbean. The Kuna, now more commonly called the Guna, still live in the region, still maintain their communities, still carry the memories of their ancestors. Whether those memories include the destruction of a French pirate in the late 17th century, we do not know. The sources that would tell us are silent. The oral traditions that might have preserved the story were not recorded by anyone who might have shared them with the outside world. What we have instead is the story as told by the colonizers. Exquemeline's account, filtered through translation and publication, through the interests of publishers who knew what would sell, through the expectations of readers who wanted adventure and horror and exotic settings. The story is not neutral. It never was. It was shaped by the circumstances of its telling, by the audiences it was designed to reach, by the purposes it was meant to serve. We cannot read it as transparent access to what actually happened. We can only read it as one layer of a palimpsest, one voice in a conversation where most of the other voices have been silenced. And yet, we keep reading. We keep telling the story. We keep returning to this figure, this name, this collection of horrors that resists our attempts to make it mean something simple. The ship that carried Lolone to his end has long since disintegrated. The wood rotted, the iron rusted, the ropes frayed and fell away. Nothing remains of the vessel that ran aground on that unknown beach, the vessel that stranded those hungry, desperate men on a coast that did not want them. The physical evidence of the voyage has returned to the elements that composed it. Only the story survives, the bodies of the men who died with Lolone, some to starvation, some to disease, some to the kuna, some perhaps to each other, have likewise vanished. The jungle is efficient at reclaiming what is placed within it. Bones become soil. Soil becomes trees. Trees become the air we breathe and the water we drink. The material substance of those men has been cycling through the ecosystem for 300 years, transformed and transformed again, scattered across continents by processes that do not distinguish between pirate and priest, victim and perpetrator. And Lolone himself, if the story is true, was consumed by human bodies, absorbed into the flesh of his killers, passed through their digestive systems, excreted, decomposed, reclaimed by the same jungle that swallowed his companions. There is something fitting in this, or something we want to find fitting, which is not quite the same thing. The man who had made himself a consumer of human lives became, in the end, food. The man who had refused all the conventions of humanity was processed finally as meat. The man who had positioned himself outside the community of mutual obligation was incorporated, literally, into a community that then expelled him. But we should not push the symbolism too hard. The kuna who killed him, if they killed him, did not know his story. They did not know about the hearts he had eaten or the tongues he had pulled from living mouths. They knew only that he was an invader, a threat, a problem to be solved. Their justice, if it was justice, was not tailored to his crimes. It was simply the justice that the jungle offers to those who enter it without permission and without the knowledge necessary to survive. The Caribbean he left behind continued its bloody business for another century and more. The Buccaneers gradually gave way to more organized forms of piracy, and piracy itself was eventually suppressed by naval power that the small operators could not resist. The sugar plantations continued their work, continued consuming enslaved bodies, continued sending their sweetened products to European tables. The imperial competition continued, with islands changing hands in wars that were decided in European capitals and fought by men who had no stake in the outcome. The system that had produced Lolone proved remarkably durable. It outlasted him by centuries. When slavery was finally abolished, in Haiti through revolution, elsewhere through legislative action that came suspiciously late, the Caribbean had been transformed beyond recognition. The indigenous populations that had once dominated these islands were gone, destroyed by disease and violence and displacement in the first century of contact. The African populations brought to replace them had become the majority, had developed their own cultures, their own languages, their own ways of surviving within a system designed to destroy them. The European populations remained in positions of power, gradually giving way as independence movements and demographic change altered the political landscape. And somewhere in all of this, in the museums and the history books and the tourist brochures and the local legends, the pirates persisted. Sanitized, romanticized, commodified, but persistent. The Jolly Roger flying from beach bars and t-shirt shops, the attractions and the theme parks and the movies, the strange transformation of murderers and thieves into figures of nostalgia and entertainment. Lolone does not fit comfortably into this transformation. He is too specific, too horrible, too resistant to the softening that time and commerce perform on historical violence. When his name appears, it appears with its attendant horrors, its catalog of atrocities, its insistence on the reality of suffering that refuses to be converted into entertainment. He is the skeleton at the feast, the reminder that the pirates were not romantic adventurers, but men who made their living through violence, who hurt people for profit, who operated in a world where human life was cheap and human suffering was a tool. The jungle where he died does not remember him. The waves that wash the beaches where his ship ran aground do not carry his name. The Guna, whose ancestors may have killed him, do not, as far as we know, tell stories about him. He persists only in the books and the accounts, in the history that has been written by people who never knew him, who gathered their information from sources that were themselves partial and interested and shaped by circumstances we can no longer fully recover. And yet he persists. The name, the image, the collection of horrors. Something in the story refuses to be forgotten, refuses to be assimilated, refuses to release its grip on the imagination. After 3.5 centuries, we are still telling this story, still trying to understand what it means, still circling around a figure who eludes our categories and disturbs our complacency. The fire he built on that first night in the Darien has long since gone cold. The smoke has dispersed. The ashes have been washed away by rains that have fallen and fallen again over the centuries. Nothing remains of that night except the story. And the story, as we have seen, is uncertain at its edges, clear only in its broad outlines, resistant to the kind of verification that would let us speak with confidence about what actually happened. But perhaps that uncertainty is appropriate. Perhaps the ambiguity at the heart of the story reflects something true about the man and the world that made him. He emerged from poverty and violence. He made himself legendary through cruelty and success. He overreached, as such men often do. He died in circumstances that no one can confirm, in a place that erased all evidence of his passing. The sea does not remember him. The jungle does not remember him. Only the stories remember him, and stories are not the same as memory. They are something else, something that partakes of memory but also of imagination, of need, of the human compulsion to make meaning from the fragments that survive. François was born into a world that treated human beings as instruments and resources. He learned its lessons well. He applied them with a thoroughness that disturbed even those who shared his profession. He rose and fell within the span of a single decade, leaving behind him a trail of suffering and a legend that would outlast the empires he plundered. And in the end, on a beach that no one can identify, in a jungle that has erased all traces of his passage, he was consumed. The consumer consumed. The torturer torn apart. The man who had insisted on the animality of others, revealed finally, as animal himself, meat for other bodies, food for the forest, nothing that the earth would remember. The tide comes in. The tide goes out. The stars wheel overhead as they have always wheeled, indifferent to the small violences that human beings inflict upon each other, indifferent to the names we give ourselves and the legends we construct. Somewhere in the Gulf of Darien, the water moves over sand, where men once starved and fought and died, and the water does not know their names, and the sand does not hold their shapes, and the story continues to be told because we cannot quite let it go, cannot quite look away from the darkness it reveals, cannot quite accept that the darkness is ours. The fire has gone out. Only the ashes remain, and the ashes do not speak.